The candles in the Ashworth ballroom numbered in the hundreds, and every one of them found the diamonds first. They found Lady Cecilia Farnham's throat, where a riviere of white stones caught the light like a sentence the season had already finished writing. They found the Duchess Dowager's wrists, heavy with sapphires older than the rain. They found the crystal in the gentleman's hands, the gilt frames above the mantel, the silver threads in every gown that mattered. What they did not find, or did not bother to find, was Eleanor Wyatt, standing near the second arch in a dress of dove-gray muslin that her own needle had taken in twice at the waist, and whose hem still showed the ghost of a crease where it had been let down. She held no glass. She wore no jewels. Her gloves, borrowed from the dowager's maid and a half-size too large, bunched faintly at her left wrist where she kept pressing them flat with her thumb, a motion so practiced it had become invisible to everyone in the room, except, it would seem, the Duke of Ashworth, who had not moved from the far wall in 4 full minutes, and whose gaze had not once returned to the woman the season had placed beside him. If the warmth of this story is something you have been waiting for tonight, stay close. It has only just begun. Eleanor had been the Duchess Dowager's companion for 8 months, and in that time she had learned precisely what a companion was. A companion was a creature of the margins. She fetched the dowager's shawl when the drawing-room grew cool, and she replaced it on the chair when the dowager grew warm. She read aloud from whichever novel the dowager selected, and stopped at whichever passage the dowager pronounced tiresome. She answered letters in a hand the dowager approved and sealed them with wax the dowager chose, and posted them at the hour the dowager preferred. She ate after the family had been served, and sat in whichever chair remained. For this she received £40 a year, a room on the 3rd floor whose window gave onto the mews, and the understanding that she was fortunate to have received anything at all, given that her father, the late Sir Edward Wyatt, had died the previous autumn, leaving debts of £200, a library of unsaleable volumes, and a daughter no one had thought to provide for. The debts had been settled by the sale of the house in Hertfordshire. The library had gone to a dealer in Paternoster Row for £11. Eleanor had kept 1 volume, a small book of verse her father had carried in his coat pocket for 30 years, its margins full of his handwriting, tiny observations in faded brown ink that annotated every stanza with the date and place he had first read it aloud to her mother. She kept it now in the drawer beside her narrow bed at Ashworth House, wrapped in a handkerchief her mother had hemmed before Eleanor was born. It was the only object in her possession that did not belong, in some functional sense, to the dowager. She had not expected to attend the ball. Companions did not attend balls. They waited upstairs with a candle and a cold supper tray, and listened to the carriages departing at 2 in the morning. The dowager had summoned her an hour before the guests arrived, and explained, in the voice she used for instructions that were not negotiable, that Lady Cecilia Farnham would be present this evening, that the Duke would be making particular attentions to Lady Cecilia this evening, and that Eleanor's presence near the refreshment table would be useful in the event the dowager required anything fetched. "You will stand where I can find you," the dowager had said, adjusting a sapphire earring in the glass. "You will not dance. You will not approach the Duke unless I send you. You will smile if spoken to, which is unlikely. You are the companion, Eleanor. Tonight more than any night I need you to remember that." Eleanor had remembered it. She stood near the second arch, her gloves pressed flat, her face composed, and she remembered it so thoroughly that she did not allow herself to look at the Duke of Ashworth more than once. Once had been enough. He was tall and dark-haired, and he stood against the far wall as though the wall were the only honest surface in the room, and his face carried the particular stillness of a man who had learned not to show what he was thinking, because what he was thinking had once cost him everything. His eyes, when they moved, moved slowly. They did not scan. They selected. And what they had selected, for 4 minutes that Eleanor was not counting, was the place where she stood in her dove-gray muslin, pressing her gloves flat with her thumb. She looked away. She pressed her gloves. Benedict Hale, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, had returned to London 3 weeks prior from the estate in Derbyshire, where he had spent the better part of 2 years. The season had been startled by his return. The season had also been prepared for it, because the Duchess Dowager had written letters to 14 families of consequence, and made it understood that her son was ready, at last, to consider the matter of a wife. Lady Cecilia Farnham, daughter of the Earl of Farnham, had been selected by the Dowager before Benedict's coach had cleared the Derbyshire county line. She was 22, beautiful, accomplished, wealthy, and she had been raised by a mother who understood precisely what a duchess was required to be. The Dowager approved. The Earl approved. The season approved. Benedict had said nothing on the subject, which the Dowager interpreted as agreement, because agreement was the only interpretation she had ever found necessary. What the Dowager did not know, because no one had told her, and because she had not considered the question worth asking, was that Benedict had watched Eleanor Wyatt every morning for the past 3 weeks. He had watched her cross the entrance hall at 7, with the Dowager's correspondence balanced on one arm and a cup of chocolate she had prepared herself balanced on the other. He had watched her sit in the window seat of the east parlor with her mending, her needle moving steadily, while the light moved across her hands. He had watched her pause at the servants' hall door to ask after Mrs. Poole, the old housekeeper who had been ill since February, and he had noticed that Eleanor asked not in the way a companion asks, which is to say efficiently, with the question already answered in the asking, but in the way a woman asks who has recently watched someone she loved grow ill and not recover. She asked, and then she listened. She listened with her whole body tilted toward the answer. He had noticed this. He had not spoken of it. The Dowager crossed the ballroom with Lady Cecilia on her arm, and the diamonds caught the light again, and the room adjusted itself around them like water parting for a launched vessel. Eleanor pressed her gloves flat. She watched them pass. She did not allow the feeling in her chest to find her face. The following morning, Eleanor carried the breakfast tray to the Dowager's sitting room at 9, as she did every morning, and found Lady Cecilia already installed in the blue chair beside the window, her gloves folded neatly in her lap, and a cup of chocolate on the table beside her that one of the Ashworth footmen had poured. The Dowager was speaking. Eleanor heard the words before the Dowager noticed her in the doorway. She is useful. I will grant her that. She writes a fair hand, and she does not complain, which is more than can be said for the last girl, who wept at the slightest correction. She is the companion, Cecilia. Nothing more. I took her on as a kindness to her father's memory, and she has repaid the kindness with adequate service. When you are settled here, you may keep her, or dismiss her as you see fit. She will not be a difficulty. She knows her place. Eleanor set the tray on the sideboard. The china did not rattle. Her hands were steady, because she had learned, in the 8 months since her father's death, that hands steady themselves when there is no one in the room who will hold them. The Dowager glanced at her and resumed speaking to Lady Cecilia about the seating arrangements for the following week's supper, and Eleanor poured the tea and placed it at the Dowager's elbow, and withdrew to the chair by the door where companions sat. And she sat very still, and she did not think about the Duke of Ashworth or the 4 minutes he had not looked away, because thinking about such things was a luxury that cost more than £40 a year could cover. That afternoon she walked to the apothecary on Half Moon Street and purchased a packet of chamomile for Mrs. Poole's cough, paying for it with coins from her own wages. The errand took her past the bookseller on Piccadilly, and she stood for a moment at the window where a volume of Cowper's verse was displayed open to a page she recognized, a page her father had read to her on a bench in the Hertfordshire garden when she was 9. The afternoon warm, and the bees loud, and the world a thing that had not yet been taken from her. She pressed her hand flat against the glass and then removed it, and walked home. 3 days after the ball, Eleanor was reading aloud to Mrs. Poole in the housekeeper's small room behind the kitchen passage when the door, which she had left ajar because Mrs. Poole preferred the sound of the house around her, opened fully. She did not look up. She was in the middle of a passage Mrs. Poole had requested twice before, a section of verse about a garden in early spring, and the old woman's breathing had finally steadied after a difficult morning, and Eleanor would not break the rhythm for anything less than fire. It was not fire. It was the Duke of Ashworth, standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame. And for a moment, he did not speak. Eleanor's voice carried the lines without faltering. Her hand rested on the page. Mrs. Poole's eyes were closed, and the thin blanket Eleanor had tucked around her that morning rose and fell with a regularity that might have been sleep. Benedict watched her read. He watched her turn the page with the hand that was not holding the old woman's wrist, where she had placed 2 fingers to feel the pulse as she read, a gesture so instinctive that she had not thought to hide it. He watched the way her voice gentled at the turn of each line, not for performance, not for an audience she did not know she had, but because gentleness was the only register she brought to a sickbed, the way a physician brings instruments. He had seen enough. He had known it before this. He had known it the morning he had watched her carry the chocolate and the letters across the entrance hall, without spilling either, her back straight, her face calm, her shoes worn at the heel in a way she thought no one had observed. He had known it the evening she had returned a plate of food to the kitchen untouched because Mrs. Poole's supper tray had not been sent up, and Eleanor had gone to see to it herself. He had known it, and knowing it had settled in him the way a decision settles when it has already been made and is only waiting for the body to act on what the mind has finished. Miss Wyatt. His voice was low, and it came from the doorway without entering the room. She looked up. Her fingers did not leave Mrs. Poole's wrist. Your Grace. You have been reading for 2 hours. Come inside and sit by the fire in the morning room. I will have someone bring tea. Mrs. Poole is not yet asleep, Your Grace. Mrs. Poole is asleep. She has been asleep since the 2nd stanza. Come inside. Eleanor looked at the old woman's face and saw that it was true. The pulse beneath her fingers was steady and slow. She closed the book and rose without argument, because the command in his voice, which another woman might have read as authority or impatience, sounded to Eleanor like something she could not yet name. She passed him in the doorway. The passage was narrow. His hand, which had been on the frame, dropped to his side, and for the width of one breath, his sleeve brushed her arm. She felt the warmth of it through the muslin. She kept walking. She did not look at his face, because she understood. With the clarity of a woman who had learned to survive inside other people's houses, that looking at the Duke of Ashworth's face in a narrow corridor with no one present was not a thing a companion could afford. He followed her to the morning room and did not sit. He stood by the mantelpiece while she sat in the chair nearest the fire and folded her hands over the small book in her lap, and neither of them spoke until the tea arrived, and when it did, he poured it himself before the footman could step forward. You read well, he said, handing her the cup. My father taught me. The late Sir Edward. Yes. I knew his name. He published a monograph on the cultivation of old roses. I read it at Eton and thought it was the only honest thing anyone had written about soil. Eleanor's hand tightened on the cup. No one in this house had mentioned her father's name in 8 months. No one had known it beyond the bare facts of his death and his debts. The sound of it in the Duke's voice, spoken without pity and without apology, and with the specific detail of a monograph she had watched her father write at the kitchen table in Hertfordshire, did something to the back of her throat that she managed, barely, to swallow before it reached her eyes. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, and her hand on the cup was not. The dinner at Lady Whitford's house 4 days later seated 30, and Eleanor attended only because the Dowager required someone to manage her wrap, her fan, and her reticule across 3 courses and a card room. Eleanor sat at the foot of the table between a curate who spoke only of drainage and a widow who spoke only of her late husband's gout. Lady Cecilia Farnham sat at the Dowager's right, and the Duke sat at the Dowager's left, and from where Eleanor watched, she could see the precise architecture of the evening the Dowager had built. Every question directed Lady Cecilia toward the Duke. Every anecdote reminded the table of the Farnham fortune, the Farnham pedigree, the Farnham estate in Kent that adjoined lands the Ashworth family had once considered purchasing. Lady Cecilia performed her part with the discipline of a woman who had been rehearsing for this evening since the age of 15. She laughed at the correct intervals. She deferred to the Dowager with the precise tilt of the head that signals respect without servility. She addressed the Duke with a warmth that was technically appropriate and emotionally calculated, leaning forward to ask about the Derbyshire grounds, about the new stable block his steward had mentioned in correspondence, about whether he still kept the grey mare that his mother had once described as the finest in the county. She was, Eleanor noted from her chair at the foot of the table, everything a duchess was supposed to be. She had the fortune. She had the face. She had the pedigree and the posture and the diamonds at her throat and the family behind her, and she had been told since girlhood that these things were sufficient, and until tonight, they always had been. The Duke answered Lady Cecilia's questions with the same measured courtesy he would have offered a visiting diplomat. His replies were correct. They were complete. They were utterly empty of the thing Eleanor had heard in his voice 3 days ago in the morning room, when he had handed her a cup of tea he had poured himself and spoken her father's name. Between the fish course and the game, Lady Whitford leaned toward her neighbor and said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as Eleanor's chair, and no farther, "Poor creature, the companion. One does wonder how long Philippa intends to keep her. She is decorative enough, I suppose, in the way of a pressed flower one finds between the pages of a dull book. There is no situation for her, of course. No dowry, no family, no prospects beyond fetching shawls until some curate is kind enough to take her." Eleanor's hands were in her lap. Her face did not change. Her fork remained beside her plate, and she did not pick it up again for the rest of the course, because the pressure behind her ribs had contracted into something small and hard and familiar. The same compressed thing she had carried since the morning the solicitor had read her father's will, and the word debts had replaced the word home. Across the table, the Duke of Ashworth set down his glass. The motion was small. The sound it made against the cloth was barely audible. He did not look at Lady Whitford. He looked at Eleanor. And for one unguarded second, the stillness in his face was not stillness at all. It was recognition, the kind that costs something, the kind that changes the shape of a room for the person who receives it. Then he turned back to his mother's conversation, and the second closed. And Eleanor told herself she had imagined it. If you have ever watched someone be spoken of as though she were furniture, and felt the ache of wanting someone in that room to see her, then you know what this story is building toward. Stay close. The following Tuesday, Eleanor was crossing the upstairs landing with the Dowager's afternoon post when she heard the pianoforte in the music room. The door was open. The Duke sat at the instrument with his coat still on and his hands on the keys, and the melody he was playing was slow and simple and unfinished, a phrase repeated twice and then abandoned. She stopped walking. She had not known he played. He looked up. His hands did not leave the keys. "Miss Wyatt, forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude." "You did not intrude. Sit down." She sat. The letters were in her lap. The melody resumed, quieter now, and in the silence between the phrases, she could hear the clock in the hall and the distant clatter of a tray being carried somewhere below, and the sound of her own breathing, which had become, she realized, very careful. "My wife played," he said, and the melody stopped. His right hand remained on a single key, pressing it without sound. "Catherine. She played this piece the evening before our son was born. She did not finish it. She was tired, and I told her to rest, and she laughed and said she would finish it in the morning." His hand lifted from the key. "There was no morning. The surgeon came too late. I was at the Derbyshire property, 40 miles from the house, settling a boundary dispute with a tenant farmer whose name I cannot now recall. I arrived in time to hold the child. I did not arrive in time to hold her." Eleanor did not move. She did not offer consolation, because consolation offered to grief of that weight, and that age would have been impertinence, and she knew it. She sat in the chair with the dowager's letters in her lap and let the silence hold what his words had opened. "The child," she said after a long moment. "Your son. William. He is 6. He lives at the Derbyshire house with his nurse. He does not come to London. My mother considers him too young for the season, and I have permitted this because I am, in some respects, a coward. And London is full of rooms where Catherine once sat." His hand went to his breast pocket, a motion so brief it might have been a habit or a twitch, and Eleanor saw the edge of something small and pale resting there, a miniature perhaps, or a fold of paper, something carried so long it had become part of the coat's architecture. "You are not a coward, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "You do not know that. I know that you poured my tea yourself, rather than let the footman do it, because you had observed that I was tired, and did not wish to make me wait an extra moment for a kindness. A coward does not notice such things." The stillness in his face shifted. Something behind it moved, briefly, like light passing across the surface of deep water, and for the first time since she had entered the room his mouth changed shape. Not quite a smile, not quite the absence of one. "Miss Wyatt." "Your Grace." "You should eat more. You missed the last 2 suppers. Mrs. Poole told me. Mrs. Poole should not trouble you with such things. Eat something. That is not a request." She rose. She gathered the letters. At the door she turned and said, "Your wife had good taste in music. The phrase you were playing resolves upward, I think, if you let the left hand lead." She did not wait for his answer. She carried the dowager's post downstairs and delivered it to the study, and stood for a moment with her back against the closed door, and her hand pressed flat to the place below her throat, where her pulse had not yet consented to slow. The next morning, the dowager summoned Eleanor to the sitting room before breakfast and closed the door. She did not invite Eleanor to sit. She stood by the fireplace with her hands clasped at her waist and her sapphire ring catching the gray light from the window, and she spoke in the voice she reserved for corrections that would not be repeated. "You were seen leaving the music room yesterday afternoon, alone. The Duke was still inside. I was delivering your post, Your Grace. I stopped when I heard the instrument. You stopped. You sat. You remained for the better part of 20 minutes. Eleanor, I have been patient. I have been more than patient. I took you into this house when you had nothing, and I have asked nothing in return except that you perform your duties and remember your position. I will ask you once. Do not make me ask you again." Eleanor waited. Her hands were at her sides. The morning light caught the worn cuffs of her sleeves, where the fabric had begun to thin at the seam. "Do not seek the Duke's company. Do not accept his invitations. Do not sit in rooms where he sits, unless I have placed you there. He is to be engaged to Lady Cecilia Farnham. The settlements are nearly agreed. The family's future depends upon this match, and I will not have it complicated by a girl with no fortune and no prospects who happens to read verse in a tolerable voice. I understand, Your Grace. I am glad." Eleanor left the sitting room and walked to the servants' hall and sat on the bench beside the cold hearth where Mrs. Poole's chair stood empty. The old housekeeper having been moved to a larger room on the ground floor that someone, Eleanor suspected, had arranged without the dowager's knowledge. She opened her father's book of verse to a page at random. The handwriting in the margin read, "April 3rd, 1793. Read to your mother by the hedge." She was wearing the blue. Eleanor closed the book and pressed it against her ribs, and breathed once, slowly, and the breath came out unsteady, and she permitted it. She did not seek the Duke's company. She did not need to. He found hers. 2 days later, she was on her knees in the east parlor mending a torn curtain hem that the dowager had declared a disgrace, and the Duke passed the open door and stopped. He stood in the corridor for a moment without speaking, watching her work with her head bent and her needle moving in the quick, precise rhythm she had learned from the seamstress who had lived in the cottage beside her father's house in Hertfordshire, a woman named Agnes who had taught Eleanor to sew a straight seam at the age of 8 and to repair anything that tore at the age of 10, and to value the work of her hands at every age since. He watched her, and she knew he was watching, and she did not look up. Because the dowager's instructions sat in her chest like a stone, and because looking up would have been an act of defiance she could not afford. And so they remained for a full minute, the Duke in the corridor and Eleanor on her knees, the needle moving and the silence between them carrying more weight than any word either of them had spoken. "The hem looks well," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace. You are always working." "There is always work, Your Grace." He said nothing more. He walked on. Eleanor's needle stopped for 3 beats of her heart, and then resumed. And the hem, when she finished it, was the straightest she had ever sewn. The dowager's announcement came on a Friday evening in the drawing-room at Ashworth House, with 12 guests assembled for an intimate supper, and Lady Cecilia Farnham seated in the place of honor, beside the empty chair the Duke had not yet occupied. The dowager stood at the head of the room and spoke in the voice she used for declarations that had already been ratified in her own mind and needed only the cooperation of the world to be made actual. "My son, the Duke of Ashworth, will announce his engagement to Lady Cecilia Farnham at the end of this month. The families are in agreement. The settlements are being drawn. I ask you to share our happiness." The room applauded. Lady Cecilia lowered her eyes in the manner of a woman who has practiced the receiving of expected news. The Earl of Farnham raised his glass. Eleanor, standing near the sideboard where the dowager had positioned her to manage the dessert wine, felt the room tilt beneath her feet, a slow, vertiginous slide that she arrested by pressing her fingertips against the sideboard's edge until the wood grain printed itself into her skin. She had not permitted herself to hope. She understood that now. She had not permitted it, and the fact that its absence could produce this weight in her chest meant only that her body had hoped without her permission, in the way a body turns toward sunlight, even when the mind has long since catalogued the reasons the sun is not for it. A guest near the window turned to his companion and said, loud enough for Eleanor and the footman beside her to hear, Philippa has managed it all beautifully. The companion will be out by month's end, I expect. One can hardly keep a young woman of no consequence in a house where a new Duchess will be managing the staff. The companion. The words landed for the third time, in the third setting, from the third voice, and this time they did not compress into the small hard thing behind her ribs. This time they cracked it open. The Duke arrived late. He entered the drawing room in evening dress, with his face carrying the stillness Eleanor had learned to read, not as coldness and not as indifference, and took one look at the assembled guests and at his mother's posture, and at the place where Lady Cecilia sat with her lowered eyes and her practiced composure, and something in the line of his jaw changed. Eleanor did not wait for the change to resolve. She set down the wine she had been holding and crossed the room to where the dowager stood, and she did something a companion had no right to do in any drawing room in London. She spoke. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried because she had spent 8 months making it small. And now she simply stopped. "I have served this house faithfully. I have fetched your shawl, and read your novels, and answered your letters, and eaten cold suppers alone in a room above the Mews. I have done this without complaint because I had no choice, and because my father raised me to meet my obligations even when they diminish me. I will not stand here and hear myself erased. If I am to leave this house, I will leave it with my name." The room was silent. The dowager's mouth opened and did not produce sound. Lady Cecilia's eyes were no longer lowered. The 12 guests held their glasses and their breath, and in the silence the clock on the mantelpiece struck the quarter hour, a single clear note that rang and faded and left the room emptier than before. Eleanor turned to leave. She had reached the second step of the entrance hall, her hand on the banister, her book of verse in the pocket of her dress, where she had kept it all evening because she had known, in the way a body knows before the mind permits it, that tonight might be the last night she spent under this roof, and she would not leave her father's words behind, when the Duke's voice stopped her. "Miss Wyatt?" She turned. He stood at the top of the step. His face was no longer still. "Come back inside. Your Grace, I cannot." "You can. You will. Come back inside." She came back inside. He walked beside her into the drawing room, and the 12 guests and the dowager and Lady Cecilia, and the Earl of Farnham and the footman with the dessert wine, all watched as Benedict Hale, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, crossed to the center of the room and stood where the light from every candle in the Ashworth ballroom, which adjoined the drawing room through a set of tall doors that the servants had opened for the evening's circulation, could find him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Wyatt will be the next Duchess of Ashworth." The words landed in the silence the description had built. They landed once. He did not repeat them. He did not elaborate. He did not turn to his mother, or to Lady Cecilia, or to the Earl of Farnham, or to the 12 guests with their held glasses. He turned to Eleanor, and for the first time since she had entered this house 8 months ago, as a woman with 200 pounds of debt, and a dead father, and a pair of shoes worn at the heel, someone with the authority to rearrange her world, looked at her as though her world had already been rearranged, and the rest was procedural. The dowager spoke. Her voice, which had never in Eleanor's hearing faltered. "Benedict, you cannot. She is the companion. She has nothing, no family, no fortune, no position. The settlements with the Farnhams are nearly complete. You cannot simply decide." "I decided 3 weeks ago, Mother. On the morning I watched her carry the correspondence and the chocolate across the entrance hall without spilling either, with her back straight and her shoes worn through, and I understood that the woman I had been waiting to see was already living in my house." Lady Cecilia rose. Her composure, which had been engineered for precisely this kind of evening, held for 3 more seconds, and then did not. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the Dowager, whose mouth was still open, whose sapphire bracelets caught the light as her hands trembled at her sides, and without a word, Lady Cecilia turned to her father and said, quite clearly, "We should go." The Earl of Farnham took his daughter's arm. They left through the hall. The 12 guests remained, their glasses still raised, their silence acquiring the quality of witness. Mr. Graves, the Ashworth solicitor, who had been seated near the window with a glass of port he had not touched, rose and cleared his throat. "Your Grace, if I may. The Duke instructed me this morning to prepare the settlement papers naming Miss Eleanor Wyatt as his intended. The documents are signed. The matter is, in the legal sense, already settled." The Dowager sat down. She did not choose the chair. She found it behind her, the way one finds a chair when standing is no longer possible. Her sapphires were still catching the light, and her face, which had governed this house and this family and this season, with the absolute confidence of a woman whose script had worked everywhere she had ever taken it, carried the expression of a woman who had encountered, for the first time, a room that her script could not manage. She did not weep. She did not rage. She looked at her son, and then she looked at Eleanor, and what she saw in Eleanor's face, which was not triumph and not vindication, and not the gloating satisfaction the Dowager might have expected from a woman who had been called the companion for 8 months, but something quieter, something closer to grief. The kind of grief that accompanies the end of a long diminishment when the diminishment has lasted long enough to feel like home, made the Dowager close her mouth and fold her hands and say nothing more. Eleanor did not know what to do with her hands. She pressed her gloves flat, and then she realized she was not wearing gloves. And the motion continued anyway, her thumb smoothing the fabric of her dress at her wrist, the habit so deep it had outlived its occasion. The Duke crossed the room to where she stood. He stopped at the distance a proper man maintains in a room full of witnesses, which was close enough that she could feel the warmth of his coat sleeve, and no closer. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice was not a declaration, and not a command, and not a proposal. It was a recognition, the same recognition she had seen in his face at Lady Whitford's dinner table, except that this time he did not turn away. "Your Grace. Benedict, if you would." She looked at his face. The stillness was gone. What remained was something she had seen only once before, in the music room, when the light had passed across the surface of deep water, and something beneath it had moved. She understood now what it was. It was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling held so long under such discipline that its release changed the shape of a man's face, the way spring changes the shape of a frozen river. "Benedict," she said. The fire in the morning room was low when they sat beside it that night, and the house was quiet, and the 12 guests had gone, and the Dowager had retired to her rooms without a word, and the servants had cleared the glasses and the dessert wine and the chair where Lady Cecilia had sat. The room smelled of beeswax and the faint smoke of a candle recently extinguished, and through the window the first snow of the season was falling in slow, thick flakes that settled on the sill and did not melt. Eleanor held the small book of verse in her lap, open to a page her father had annotated on a Tuesday in September 20 years ago, his handwriting so faded it was almost the color of the paper, the note reading only, "Read this one aloud to your mother in the garden." She smiled. Benedict sat in the chair across from her. His coat was off. His cravat was loosened, a thing she had never seen, and the informality of it changed the shape of his face in a way that made him look, for the first time, like a man who lived in a house, rather than a man who governed one. His hand, which had rested in his breast pocket so many times she had lost count, rested now on the arm of the chair, and the pocket, she noticed, lay flat against his chest. The miniature, whatever it was not there. "I put it away," he said, as though he had heard her looking. Catherine's portrait. "I placed it in the drawer of my writing desk this evening, beside a letter she wrote me before William was born. It will stay there. It is where it belongs now." Eleanor did not ask what had replaced it. She did not need to. The book in her lap, the fire between them, the sound of snow beginning to fall against the window of a house she no longer entered as a servant and would never again leave as one, were answer enough. Somewhere above them, in a nursery in Derbyshire, a 6-year-old boy named William slept with his hand curled around the ear of a cloth rabbit, and in the spring he would come to London, and the woman who read aloud with such gentleness that even a sleeping housekeeper breathed easier would read to him too. The fire settled. The snow thickened against the glass. Eleanor turned the page of her father's book and read the next stanza silently, her lips barely moving, the words so familiar they were less language than heartbeat. And beside her, in the chair where the 6th Duke of Ashworth sat, with his hands finally still and his face finally open, the quiet that filled the room was not the quiet of an empty house. It was the quiet of a house that had, at last, enough people in it. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's journey moved you, leave a word below for the moment you felt the room change.